Hello there and welcome back to Valdis Story. Let's give one of our other assists a shot this time. We've been using plenty of Conte and Bulwark, so let's give Reese the chance to shine. Mayhaps we'll check out Shadowboxer later as well. Now, before we get on doing our main goal today, we're going to upgrade our armor, the Monk's Robes. I took the time to farm up a few polished stones to trade into that strange child upstairs, so we actually had the materials to upgrade it. Once you figured out whatever armor piece you want to stick with, you definitely want to upgrade it as quickly as possible. Each upgrade makes a huge difference in the overall potency of its effects, even if it's an effect that doesn't have a numerical value listed. So, today we're going to go on a great big quest and open up all of the doors that are locked with that angelic key. Alright there, we've accomplished our goal. Yeah, for some reason there's only one actual angel door in the entirety of the game. Apparently in previous versions there used to be more of them, but they ended up getting removed and mostly replaced with demon doors, or something like that. My knowledge of the previous versions, despite having played it during those iterations, is pretty poor. As I've said before, most of my playtime comes after the patch that added Gilda and Vladin, at which point most of the changes had already taken place, so I am quite often inaccurate. For example, as someone corrected me in the thread, the patch that added the Abomination phase to the Distan and Azudor fight also added the possessed Distan boss. Previously, defeating either of them first would lead to Soul Rage Azudor, and the fight with Soul Rage Azudor actually used to be quite different as well. If ever I end up saying something that is not quite accurate, feel free to correct me. I have a good knowledge base of this game, but it's by no means perfect, and I do want to try and be as accurate and informative as possible. So, here we are in the Engineer's Palace. In terms of enemies, there's nothing explicitly new. I believe all of these angelic enemies are things we've fought before, and none of them are particularly dangerous, but dealing with them can be tricky in some of these rooms, thanks to all these environmental obstacles, all the various lightning traps that end up coming out quicker than I always expect, so I often get hit by a few of them. And these traps are actually surprisingly dangerous because the affliction that they inflict is not a form of paralysis, not stun, is what the game calls it. Rather, instead, it is a separate affliction called static, which reduces your attack power and magic power by half, a sharp cut to your offensive capabilities. On the bright side, these static traps don't exactly deal a whole amount of damage, so you're unlikely to actually die in this area even if you end up doing poorly. It's no fire temple. Now, even if we wait for ages, that beam above us will never disappear. We'll have to figure out some other way of getting around it. For now, that means heading onward, deeper into the palace, and dealing with the enemies on our way. Again, we've fought pretty much all of them before, although we've never actually seen those Guardian Angels outside of the Magus boss fight, if I recall correctly. This is where they show up as an actual proper enemy from time to time. In this room we have another one of these time puzzles, and just take my word on it, actually, you don't need to because I'm showing off exactly why. It's not a good idea to do this as soon as you enter the room. It's not impossible to do, I've done it before, but it is so ridiculously tightly timed, mainly due to the timing of these static traps kind of halting your progress a fair bit. Just have a bit of patience and it'll end up being a lot easier after you end up getting the main item in this place. For now though, we're just gonna have to be patient and move in between these static traps, which isn't always the easiest thing in the world, especially when we're fighting flying enemies on precarious platforms. Yeah, this is another instance of the platforming and the combat not exactly combining in the best of ways here. It's best to just take it slow and steady so you don't fall off, because if you fall off, you're just going to end up wasting more time than if you hadn't rushed. Now, this spot right here is worth pointing out specifically because it is the best place to farm that one enemy type. Zealous Priests or something like that. These dudes here, the ones that summon golden shields and options. They have a rare chance to drop gems of purity, only one of which you get guaranteed from a chest in the game. And it's an item that's needed for a few accessories, so you may end up having to farm for that item. Anyway, over here we have a somewhat familiar sight. Turns out, Tegu, the boss we fought way back when as our third boss encounter, had a sister, and she's out for revenge. I really like this encounter here because it shows just how far your character has come. What was previously a proper boss fight is now nothing more than just a slightly larger than usual enemy. One that we don't even have trouble dealing with. And even with a less optimized build, she's never really all that difficult. It just emphasizes just how strong you become since the beginning of the game, and I like that. It's a nice little boost of confidence which you're probably going to need, because depending on your build, this next boss fight here with Treyu can be a bit of a pain in the ass. Story-wise, he was Reina's replacement for the Golden Child position after she had left. Gameplay-wise, he ends up being something of a mirror match. Not quite one-to-one, but he shares similar moves to Reina using martial arts. Much like Reina, his individual strikes aren't all that powerful, but they come so quick and so often that it's very difficult to avoid them. Add in the fact that he loves teleporting all over the place and just dodging and weaving like a friggin' bumblebee. It can end up being surprisingly difficult to accurately block or parry all of his blows. Add in the fact that he loves throwing around electric projectiles that only become more numerous as the fight goes on, and avoiding taking damage in this fight is really difficult. Fortunately, after you bring down his HP enough, you are given that little break phase, where you simply need to platform your way up to him and then strike him once to return the fight to its usual state. The lasers that he fires are slow enough that you can end up taking that time to heal yourself or rebuff or just collect your thoughts, if you so feel the need. Now, this attack right here is perhaps my least favorite of all of his attacks. He ends up disappearing for a time, during which you cannot harm him at all, and instead you have to focus purely on dodging all of the projectiles that he spawns on the screen. The fight basically ends up becoming a bullet hell for a short time, and this game is at its worst when its fights end up being bullet hells. Your ability to move your character precisely just isn't good enough to actually weave through a lot of these patterns. And while we can take a page from the book of the Abigail fight and just put up our guard, that isn't always effective because some of these projectiles can end up spawning behind us, thus forcing us to constantly readjust our guard. And if attacks are coming from two directions at once, we really don't have much of a choice there. And even if you do block a projectile, it can end up sending you back, possibly into one of these stun traps. Ultimately, I can respect what they were trying to do here. They were trying to take advantage of their 2D medium and the fact that 2D side-scrolling gameplay often goes hand in hand with platforming, and try and make a boss that wouldn't work in a more three-dimensional game. But, they kind of failed. And this is the fight as it is after several patches. From what I've heard, this fight used to be so much worse. Both because in previous iterations of the game, this was the boss that you acquired the double jump spell from. So imagine trying to do this platforming without that increased aerial maneuverability. And apparently the boss room itself was designed differently as well, having more stun traps. So it was a more rigorous platforming experience as well. Anyone who can clarify further as to these statements, I would be extremely grateful to. But yeah, this has been the Treyu fight. Despite all my gripes, I can at the very least say it's not all that difficult of a boss to S-rank. The combat and time scores are generous enough that even if you take a while and end up getting hit a bunch, you're incredibly likely to get an overall S-rank. And we of course got a coveted S-rank. Especially great here considering the S-rank bonus is getting a permanent boost to our intelligence and agility, both of the stats that we've been focusing on. It's just good stuff all around. And the good times ain't stopping here, as when this cutscene eventually ends, after a bit more conversing, we end up picking up possibly the most useful soul in the game, even with it no longer providing the crucial Metroidvania ability of double jumping. It still provides some really good utility for more melee-focused builds. As we'll be seeing once Reina finally finishes her monologue here. Geez, this went on for longer than I remembered. Goodbye and good riddance, Treyo, you whiny baby, jeez. He does a great disservice to the Golden Child title, that's for sure. So, we've finally reached level 15. And that means we have the final tier of skills on each of the trees available to us. And for the monk tree specifically, that means a permanent boost to our base attack, always welcome, as well as much faster focus generation. So the focus party times are just gonna get better and better, boys, and girls, and NBs. Now of course, the true reward for this fight is a new soul, the Lightning Soul, the soul of the Warden. And the incredibly useful spell it provides. Both the air spell and the side spell end up being a lightning chain that you can use to grapple towards your enemies, either pulling you to them or them to you, depending on your respective weights. This is so useful for chasing after the more agile enemies, as I will completely fail to show off later on. So for the down spell, we have the ability to charge ourselves with a bolt of lightning. Didn't Claudius say that this mana heater would be good as new if we could charge it up? Well, if it's on a person and we use that move, yeah, it gets charged. Yeah, this is a cool little bit of outside-of-the-box puzzle solving that the game really actually has you do. I like it, but I wish the game had more instances of this kind of thing. Anyway, the last spell is the one that you need to use to figure out how to leave the room entirely, given the fact that the only way out is blocked by a permanent stun trap. The up spell is a barrier that protects you from 3 blows from stun traps. And only stun traps, I'll note. Other forms of lightning damage will still be able to pierce it, which makes it a bit less useful than it could be. Despite the fact that it's a shield, its primary combat use is still as an offensive weapon buff, like all of the other up spells. So, as I informed before, this timing puzzle would be so much easier if we just waited a bit, and this is why. We can just ignore that stun trap entirely and have a whole boatload of time to spare. And for doing so, we've rescued yet another crew member, Cynthia. I really like her design. It combines the anime tropes of badass scarred lady and half-blind person, and that just really appeals to me. She also has purple hair, and purple is the best hair color. I will take no arguments to the contrary. So now we actually have to leave the Engineer's Palace, and if you try to do so from the way that you came in, you're gonna have a bit of a tough time. It's not impossible by any means, but the traps and the platforming segments were clearly set up to be gone through one way specifically. And backwards is not that one way. Fortunately, they do give you a very quick and even more convenient exit right in this room here. Which I'll get to after I stop sucking at the combat in this room here. It's kinda weird, I have no trouble taking down a giant mech-suited angel, and I only have a relatively small amount of trouble with the boss, and yet it's regular enemies that end up balking me so. That I kept trying to attack enemies while the Guardian Angel was still active probably didn't help any. Had a bit of a brain fart there. So, Reese certainly has been coming in handy in this area, hasn't he? He is definitely one of the more useful assists in the game, which I'm sure his creator is glad of. Apparently, regarding Reese's appearance in the Shovel Knight DLC Plague of Shadows, his creator was rather upset that they actually have Reese lose a battle, which, canonically, is not a thing that can ever occur, and he apparently raised a stink about it. If that is the case, then I take back what I said before about my jibes being all in good fun, cause fuck that dude. Anyway, we acquired 1/2 of the materials that we need to assemble the Divine Key, and saved Ishq in one fell swoop. Next time we return to this area, the mana heater will be saved, and Ishq will be safe for the rest of the game. So, before we actually get to our next new area for the day, we're going to be doing a little bit of backtracking, both because it's on the way to that new area and we're able to pick up some new items that we couldn't get before. And I do aim to try and pick up everything, but no guarantees because I always somehow manage to miss a few treasure chests on my playthroughs of this game. Anyway, while we're doing that, it's worth discussing the Save Ishq situation a bit more in detail, because previously things didn't always work out exactly how they do in the current iteration of the game. One major change is that previously the game actually had an internal timer, which was based off both the amount of real-world playtime that you had and the number of retries that you used, each retry acting as an extra 30 minutes to that timer. Now, after enough time had passed on that timer, certain plot events would trigger, at which point you would have a limited amount of, again, real-world time to solve those problems. This meant that if you ended up taking too much time exploring, you could end up failing to save these cities, even before you had the chance to discover what you needed to do to save them. And that's why, after enough complaining, they ended up switching it to a plot event-based trigger system. Now you have until turning over the materials to Sezi to make the Divine Key, before you end up failing to save Ishq. If I'm not mistaken, in one of the earliest iterations of the game, it was actually impossible to save Ishq, and you just had to beat the game before the timer ran out if you wanted to save those people. An interesting example of changing something that's fairly novel, time systems in video games are rare, for something that's more comfortable to the player. I'm not going to make a judgment call here as to whether that was a good or a bad decision, but personally I do prefer the actual real-time system. I just love that sort of stuff in video games. So, speaking of progressing events, the reason why before I mentioned that you want to take down Magus as soon as possible is that, at this point in the game, she ends up being replaced by the Mana War here. If you don't kill her by then, she presumably either moves on or gets killed by this big old jellyfish anyway. This here is another one of those boss fights that was added at a later stage in development, and it's probably one of the least impressive ones that was added. It's a pretty novel fight as the Mana War will switch between each of the elements that's available in the game, and having a different attack pattern for each of those elements. But appropriate enough for a jellyfish, I suppose, it's squishy enough that unless you're a seriously underpowered build, you're probably going to end up slaughtering it before it has a chance to show off all those elements, as what occurred here. Mayhaps we'll have a more difficult time as Vladin. Though even if we don't, I will strive when we play through as Vladin to end up showing off some of the bosses we ended up incidentally skipping as Reina. For such an easy boss fight, we ended up getting a not too amazing reward. The second of the 3 Archful spirits I mentioned. It'll be useful when used in tandem with the other 2 and some other items to make a rather valuable trade, but by itself it's rather worthless. So, skipping ahead a bit, we're now using the Demon Key. Whereas there aren't many angelic doors in the game, there are quite a few demonic ones, most of which are on the way to our next area. This one right here is the one where we encountered our very first skill cancel, and we encountered another crew member whose use we'll see next time we go back to the library. This right here is that one bit of platforming I tried to do earlier before picking up the double jump. It's intended to be done after having the double jump though. A new assist, Axon. If you actually manage to do that tricky bit of platforming early on, she's probably the best assist you can get for quite a while, because she's powerful and importantly she ends up striking from behind, which is incredibly useful against all of the blocking enemies. After all, much like your blocking, their blocking is unidirectional, so if you attack from the front and she attacks from behind, enemies can't do too much about it. I end up using her for a little bit here just to show her off, but I do end up switching her out for other assists. She's useful, but at this point, unless we're also using the Volt Aura spell which boosts her damage, she's not especially amazing. Now, before we actually head on to the new area through that demon door over there on the right, we have a bit of a secret we could have accessed way back when. As soon as we picked up the ice pillar, in fact. A secret that is actually a bit of a double secret, as we'll be seeing. A rare instance of something being especially well hidden in this game. Usually most stuff is out in the open, but not here. So the first layer to this onion-like secret is this gentleman right here, the mercenary. Arguably the most powerful assist in the game, but quite pricey, requiring 3 ancient coins. Now, the second layer to this secret is that one of those ancient coins, one of the guaranteed ones, is hidden behind that illusory wall, to my knowledge the only such wall in the game. Reina sadly will not be making use of the mercenary's services. She has better uses for her coins. So, now we come to everyone's favorite area, the Ziggurat. That is a lie, as you could probably tell from the tone of my voice. This is a lot of players' least favorite area, for reasons we'll be getting into the juicy details of as we go along. For one, the enemies here are some of the most annoying enemies in the game. Just lots of teleporting bullshit and powerful ranged magic attacks that you have to constantly dodge and weave your way through, while doing enough platforming to actually make it through these rooms. Also, enemies attacking you from off-screen that you cannot possibly get to, or at least will have a lot of difficulty doing so. Needless to say, Kante is probably the most useful assist here, since he strikes an entire room regardless of where he currently is, muting them, which in the case of all these mage enemies neuters them quite a bit. And so of course I don't actually switch to Kante until much later, because I am SMRT smart. There's also a number of encounters here that are made so much easier if you end up doing the Engineer's Palace first, as we did, and you use those lightning grapple spells to bring yourself closer to the enemies, or the enemies closer to you, whichever the case may be. Naturally, I don't make much use of that either. Yeah, sorry, I'm just bad about getting into a rut with the video games I play and not actually experimenting even when I know it would help me. I will try and show off the lightning grapple spells in particular in the future. In fact, there's one boss fight where if I don't do so, I'll probably end up having a hell of a time. And I mean that in a negative way, not a positive one. So, as we ascend this pillar, or really just ignore it entirely thanks to our double jump, we end up coming to what is probably the single most annoying room in the game. Maybe. There's one later that could also qualify for that position, but yeah, there's a reason why I employed speeding here. This room is massive, and all of the enemies can end up attacking you from quite a distance away. Worse still, anytime you get near them, they can end up teleporting away to another one of the platforms, and it can be difficult to actually make it to there because of all the projectiles that end up filling the screen. It's pretty much just a big old game of cat and mouse where you're at an enormous disadvantage. Now, technically speaking, you don't have to fight any of these enemies. You could just ignore them, get to the top, activate the mana crystal, and get the F out. However, that can actually be surprisingly difficult if you don't take out the enemies first, especially if you do not pick up the superior mana keystone, or you ended up playing this game before that was added. After all, the mana keystone by default ends up having a 3 or 4 second charge up time, and the enemies attack frequently enough that they will probably stun you out of your charge before you fully charge your crystals. But yeah, that room is garbage. Thankfully, we're well past it at this point. And we've acquired a new bit of armor, not this dreadnought one here, that's one we picked up in the mines that we previously did. Not a bad armor piece, but I feel like its bonuses are a little bit too spread out to be useful for most builds. Dead Man's Fury, on the other hand, is one of the more interesting armor sets, since it ends up adding some pretty unique bonuses. The more you attack enemies without getting hit yourself, the more stacks of Fury you end up building up. And the more stacks of Fury you have, the more fire damage you end up dealing with your regular physical attacks. And I do think this ends up stacking with the fire buff. Even better, at max Fury you end up having a fairly potent amount of life leech. 5% may not seem like much, but look at the hits we're dealing. We're typically dealing in the hundreds of damage. So we would end up recovering dozens of HP per each one of our attacks. Nothing to sneeze at, that. As interesting as it is though, it's not the best armor set for Reina as we've built her, so we're going to forego it. So that fight right there with that spider bitch. Probably one of the more difficult enemies to fight in the game. Thankfully there's only like 2 of them in the entirety of the game. In that room in particular though, it can be incredibly annoying because if you're in just the right place when you get knocked back by its powerful slamming attack, you can end up falling into one of those pits into the previous room. Do you know what that previous room is? Yep, it's the big one with all of those teleporting assholes. Thank God it did not happen here, but I've had that happen on previous playthroughs, and let me tell you, it's rather infuriating. Fortunately, it is pretty much the last pit stop on this road of trouble that we've been traveling. All that's next is the boss. This is a rather interesting boss fight because it's the first we fought where we're not quite alone. As we'll be seeing after I change up my spell loader a little bit. Wyatt's here. This is actually a somewhat interesting way that the different campaigns diverge. In that if you're Wyatt, no other NPC shows up, so you have to fight Gano one-on-one. But if you play as anyone else, you have a little bit of a helper in the form of Wyatt. And Wyatt here can actually be surprisingly useful, especially if you're having trouble fighting Gano. Much like the NPC phantoms in Dark Souls, he may not be very aggressive or good at dealing damage to a boss, but damn if he isn't an excellent tank. I'm not even sure if he can be killed, so he is always an extra active target for Gano to focus on as opposed to you. Not that this helps Reina all that much because, well, you'll see. I'm just gonna leave this fight uncommentated for you to appreciate fully. Yeah, that went pretty quickly, didn't it? Kind of a reversal of the situation with Lotso, where this time it is the demonic boss that we end up chumping. It's kind of funny, on previous playthroughs of this game with different characters with different builds, I've ended up having Gano act as something of a roadblock and having to reattempt the fight so many times, whereas I ended up just carving my way through Treu. Whereas on this playthrough, Gano was a complete pushover, but I had a surprisingly amount of difficulty with Treu. Ultimately, that comes down to the fact that while it is an action game, partially, it's also an RPG game, partially, and thus your build is an equal contributor to your performance as your skill is. As a demon, Gano is especially weak to divine damage compared to Treu, who is a little bit more resistant to it, and that's why we chumped him. We didn't even get to see his gimmick, which I promise I will show off when we play through as Vladin. even if I have to force it. Thinking about it now, it actually would have been better to have done the Ziggurat first and then the Engineer's Palace, since with the new Dark Soul that we've acquired from Gano, we probably would have had a much easier time with Treyu. Well, hindsight's 2020, and this is usually the order that I do these areas in. But that's the fun of playing through these open, build variety having games like this multiple times. You end up having different experiences with the same situations. So with this new spell, the Void Elemental spell, most of its magics we're not going to be using. They're of the directly offensive type, which as a build with a slight investment in intelligence would not be too useful to us. Only appropriate considering just how useful the Volt Soul is. But the side spell in particular is something we'll be needing to use to get to a few items. We've encountered this pattern of spiked boxes before, and this is how we get past it. I suppose we could also use this to move throughout the battlefield, but it's laborious enough to do that it's really not all that useful. If you could do it a bit faster, I could see it having some use, but as it is, it's not that great. The up spell too is actually surprisingly useful. It's Void Elemental, so it does extra damage versus angelic enemies, which is something we're somewhat lacking in, focusing on Divine. But even more useful is that rather than providing a flat damage buff to our attacks, it instead summons a separate attack, a Blade of Void, every time we end up scoring a critical hit. The damage on most enemies isn't all that impressive, but the important thing is that it is another hit, and thus gives us even more stun locking capabilities, especially when used in tandem with the totem. Oh, so right here we have probably my favorite Kickstarter backer character because it's just a lazy-ass panda with a cannon strapped to its back. A very simple concept and a wonderful one for it. It's also an assist, and a very useful assist, at least once you level it up. It has a very long cooldown time, not as bad as Kante, but still pretty up there. But it makes up for that for being one of the strongest assists in the game, and doing all of its damage in a single strike, so it's especially good at piercing enemy defenses as well. Oh yeah, so that stun locking potential I mentioned earlier, this is a good example of that. Void magic is especially good at stun locking enemies because the affliction that it causes is stun. With a high enough affliction chance and a little bit of luck, you can basically completely shut down any enemy in the game that's not outright immune to stun. It's not so useful against bosses for the obvious reasons, but against regular enemies, it's pretty strong. You know, it's kind of funny. At the end of the previous playthrough I did before starting this LP, I was starting to feel a little bit wary about playing this game again. I have over 100 hours in it, and I've tried out so much stuff in the multiple playthroughs I've done, that I had just gotten a little bit tired of playing and was worried I wouldn't have the enthusiasm to actually continue through with the LP, as I had planned it, doing at least 2 playthroughs. But actually being here, in the now, in the moment, using all of these things that the game is giving me, I'm actually enjoying the game far more than I realized I would. And that's pretty much the strongest ringing endorsement I can give of this game's combat. Despite all its myriad faults, it does enough right and has just enough sheer variety that it's still fun to play through over and over, even now, with all of my experience. Anyway, we're back in Ishq and we've saved it. And one of the things that I really like, a nice little touch that doesn't add a lot but shows that the developers cared, is that most of the NPCs actually respond to this. All of their dialogue changes when it starts freezing over, and most of them change back to some sort of congratulations once you've saved it. And that does a lot to actually make this feel like a more real and lived-in world, as anime as it is. Speaking of anime, we're back with Budget Master Roshi here, delivering some exposition. He's not exactly sure what these fellow creatures are, but he does know they tend to avoid humans so long as they don't trespass on their territory. They sure do have a sweet tooth for demonic and angelic flesh though. It's a delicacy to them. Also, yeah, it turns out he actually had a divine key the entire time and sent us on a fetch quest for nothing. Well, okay, to be fair, he did need to be sure that we were true to our word, and were actually doing this for the right reasons, and had the fighting capability to actually survive in the areas that the divine key has locked. So maybe I've been too harsh on him. He seems like a decent enough Okay, never mind. Budget Master Roshi through and through. Well, that aside, we're pretty much done here. In fact, at this point, if we so desired, we could go to the final area of the game and beat it in under a half hour. But this is a comprehensive playthrough, so before we do that, we have a few extra areas to explore and a few super bosses to fight. Look forward to that next time.